The case of the Yuba County Five is easily one of the most bizarre unsolved cases I've ever heard. It's a case that will stick with you, haunt you, long after you've heard it. For me personally, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it for days. The layers of this case are truly unexplainable. 5 men who on February 24th, 1978 were having a simple, fun boys' night out before vanishing miles and miles and miles away from their intended destination in one of the strangest disappearances and unsolved mysteries of all time. This is the mysterious enigma of the Yuba County Five. Welcome back to another episode of Hot on the Case. If this is your first time joining us for an investigation, here at Hot on the Case, we talk all things true crime with a focus on the unsolved and unexplained. So if mysteries are your thing, please consider following the show wherever you are listening, whether that's on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or if you're watching the video version on YouTube. Please don't forget to like, rate, and review the show because it really does help. And if you're a returning subscriber, thank you so much for being here. My name is Brianna, and I'm hot on the case. Before we dive into the bizarre elements of this case, let's take a moment to talk about the 5 men at the center of it and their dynamic as a group. One of the most well-known yet often misunderstood aspects of this case is that each of the men had some form of mental or cognitive disability. However, based on my research and more importantly, first-hand accounts of their family members, this aspect has been widely exaggerated in many retellings, sometimes even sensationalized in crude headlines. In reality, all 5 of these men were pretty high-functioning and capable of living pretty independent lives. In their hometown of Yuba County, California, the men were known locally as the Boys. The group consisted of Jack Huett, William Bill Sterling, Jack Madruga, Theodore Ted Weiher, and Gary Mathias. They all became friends through the Gateway Projects, a local program designed to assist people with mental disabilities and mental illnesses. Jack Huett was the youngest member of the Boys at just 24 years old. Out of all of them, Jack had the most significant cognitive challenges. He was completely illiterate, he had a pretty noticeable speech impediment, and struggled to maintain a traditional job. But that didn't mean that Jack wasn't capable. Jack worked with his father on their farm, which had a lot of pretty intense tasks that Jack had to do that required skill and dedication. Jack also loved riding dirt bikes, and he did it quite often, so he's capable of operating a motorized vehicle. Jack was quite shy and tended to follow the lead of his friends, and those who knew him described him as incredibly sweet and trusting. His best friend was 32-year-old Ted Weiher. Ted was the oldest member of the Boys. He was a kind-hearted, gentle giant who, like Jack, had also been officially diagnosed with a mental disability. But if there was one thing about Ted, it was that he fiercely looked after his best friend Jack. No one was going to mess with his best friend on his watch. Ted could also hold down a traditional job. He worked a variety of different jobs and at the time was a bagger at a local grocery store. Honestly, Ted's biggest struggle was that he lacked common sense and street smarts, which often led Ted to make some pretty odd decisions. His family managed his finances because left to his own devices, he could make some really impulsive purchases, like the time that Ted spent over $100 on pencils for no reason. There was also this one time in the middle of the night where Ted's family home caught on fire, and his panicked parents ran into his room to wake him up, get him out of the burning building. They woke him up. Ted saw that his ceiling was on fire, and he just rolled over and tried to go back to sleep because he said that he had work in the morning, and if he got up then, he would be too tired for work the next day. Ted also had a long list of things that he was scared of, which included the woods, the dark, and unsurprisingly, after the fire incident, fires. In the group, there was also Jack Madruga, who was 30 years old, and Bill Sterling, who was 24 years old, and they were best friends since childhood. Unlike Ted and Jack Huett, neither had been formally diagnosed with any disability. They were both described as just being kind of slow because this was the 1970s. Bill Sterling was the super outgoing, full of energy one. He was always talking. He had a very loud, boisterous personality. He was smart but lacked motivation. People said that he was smart but lazy, and those around him said that they believed he could do more if he just applied himself. Bill was deeply religious, and most weekends actually volunteered his time to read his Bible to the sick and elderly patients at the local hospital. Jack Madruga, his best friend, on the other hand, was kind of the exact opposite of Bill. He was more quiet, reserved, and socially awkward. Jack Madruga had a difficult time in school, but after graduating high school, he thrived in the military, where he served as a truck driver for the Army, and after leaving the Army, he was able to hold down steady jobs. Jack was also one of 2 members of his friend group that had a driver's license, and more importantly, he was the only one that owned his own car, a 1969 Mercury Montego. And when I say that he cherished this car, I really mean it. This car to Jack was his prized possession. He did all his own work on the car and refused to let anyone else drive it. And this detail about how much this car meant to Jack Madruga is going to be very, very important in this case. The final member of the boys and the newest addition to the circle was 25-year-old Gary Mathias. Unlike the other members, Gary did not have a mental disability, but was instead diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Despite being the most intellectually capable of the group, his past was very troubled. During high school, Gary became heavily involved in drugs, starting with marijuana before moving on to harder substances like speed. He eventually joined the Army, but was discharged after he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and after he had many psychotic outbursts, which also include some pretty violent episodes. And what followed was a very dark period of his life filled with instability and crime. Gary had an extensive criminal history, including multiple violent offenses, some of which we'll get into later in this episode. Gary's parents got really worried for their son and his downward spiral that he was going on, so they actually sent their son to go live with his grandparents in Portland, Oregon. They hoped that maybe a change of scenery would help him, but that was not the case. Gary had other plans because one day he just simply walked out of his grandparents' house in Portland, Oregon, and then showed up on his parents' doorstep in Yuba County after walking over 550 miles to get there, which is a very, very long walk and pretty strange, I'm not gonna lie. By the time that our case begins, Carrie had been a part of the Gateway Projects for about 2 years, and thanks to finally being treated for his schizophrenia, he really turned his life around. For the past 2 years, Gary was a model citizen and was seen as one of the program's biggest success stories. And it was actually one of his counselors at the Gateway Projects that introduced him to the other 4 men that I just told you about, thinking that Gary would really benefit from having some really good friends. And from that moment on, the 5 men became inseparable. They did everything together. They had a close, deep bond from being able to understand each other better than the rest of the world could. In the rest of the world, each of these men were outcast, but together they belonged. And because of Gary's really strong personality and higher intellect, Gary naturally became kind of like the leader of the group, and he was fiercely protective of his new friends, and he took that role very seriously. And one of the bigger things that really bonded the boys together was their love for basketball. They played together on the Gateway Projects team, the Gateway Gators. And they weren't just casual players either, they were actually pretty good. On February 25th, 1978, they actually had a huge game planned for that day. It was a tournament hosted by the Special Olympics, which is a pretty big deal and really, really cool. And there was a huge prize for the winners of that tournament, a free trip to LA and Disney. So pretty big deal. And the boys were so excited about this. They had been looking forward to this tournament for weeks, and it was honestly all that they could really talk about, but they would never get a chance to play that big tournament they were so excited about, because the night before the big game, all 5 men vanished without a trace. The day before their big game, the 5 men actually planned to go to a UC Davis basketball game together. They had those day before Christmas jitters and excitement, and they wanted to kind of go hype themselves up for their own basketball game by going to this one and watching this basketball game. It was February 24th, 1978. It was a pretty cold night. It's the dead of winter, even for California, and none of the men were really dressed for the weather, at all, really, because they were only expecting to be in Jack Madruga's car or a hot gym that evening. The game was at California State University in Chico. It was a 50-mile drive about an hour away, and the game wasn't expected to end until after 10 p.m. So several of the boys laid out everything they would need for their own game the following day, and they all told their parents that they planned to just go straight home after the game, go straight to bed, because they wanted to be well rested for the big day they had the following day. Jack Madruga, in his prized 1969 Mercury Montego, went and picked up his 4 friends, and they made their little mini road trip to the basketball game. And after the game was over, they left the game a little bit before 10 p.m. without incident. None of the people that saw them at the game, no witnesses, said that anything weird happened or thought that any of the men seemed off at all. And after the game, the 5 of them stopped at a little nearby store to buy some snacks, soda, and candy for the ride home. All in all, up to this point, it seemed like they were having a great night. They're out with the boys, they're out with their best friends, they're watching sports, they're eating candy, but for whatever reason, the boys never made it home. At this point, each of them still lived at home with their parents. They were all pretty much creatures of habit. They did whatever they said they were going to do, and they told each of their parents that after the game they planned to go straight home and go straight to bed. So each of their parents start calling the other parents in a panic to see if their own son maybe stayed the night at one of their houses, because it wasn't uncommon for them to have sleepovers. Maybe after the long night and the long drive, they decided to just be easier to crash at one of their places, but obviously this is not what happened, and each of the men would be reported missing. Investigators in Yuba County and the nearby county of Butte both put out info to the public asking for them to keep an eye out for the men and also for Jack Madruga's 1969 Montego. But there were no sightings or leads for days. And then on the 4th day of their disappearance, Jack Madruga's car was found, but this breakthrough brought forth more questions than answers. A forest ranger came across the abandoned vehicle on an unpaved road in the rugged terrain of Plumas National Forest alongside Oroville Quincy Road. He actually noticed the car 3 days earlier, but didn't think much of it at the time because it was pretty common for people to go up into the mountains for a couple of days, to camp or hike, and sometimes also in the winter for their cars to get stuck. It wasn't until he saw the reports that the vehicle was being actively searched for that he alerted the authorities. And this is where this case becomes truly bizarre. For one, let's just talk about the geography. The 5 men had left the basketball game in Chico, and from there, their route home to Yuba City should have been incredibly simple, a nearly straight shot. Instead, their car was found a staggering 70 miles away in the complete opposite direction. And before anyone suggests that they had just taken a wrong turn, no, this was not any minor navigational mistake. Somehow, Jack Madruga had driven his beloved car, his prized possession, deep into the mountains, up an unpaved road in the dead of night. The vehicle was discovered at 4,400 feet in elevation, just beyond the snow line where the mountain's snow caps began. This was no accidental detour. This definitely wasn't a case of missing an exit and ending up in unfamiliar territory. For one reason or another, they had intentionally driven into the wilderness far from where they were supposed to be, and that alone is baffling. Why would they veer so drastically off course? Why push a car up a remote snow-covered mountain when they had a big game the next day, something that they had been looking forward to for weeks? And beyond the sheer impracticality of it, there was a psychological factor too. Several of the men were known to be afraid of the dark, afraid of the wilderness. Ted Weiher, for example, had a deep-seated fear of the woods and the dark. Bill Sterling, too, was uncomfortable in remote outdoor settings, and yet somehow all 5 of them ended up there on a freezing, desolate mountain miles and miles away from anywhere they should have been. There are so many layers to this mystery, and we'll get into theories later, but for now, there's an even bigger question to address. Jack Madruga's car has been found, but the 5 men, they were nowhere to be seen. When the authorities discovered the car, it was stuck in the snow and ice, but not in the way that should have been a real problem. Like, it was stuck, but barely. One of the back tires had clearly spun in space and struggled for traction, but the car itself was like barely stuck. A single person giving it a light push likely would have been enough to free it. And yet, none of the 5 men, who were all young, athletic, and perfectly capable of handling a situation like this, made no attempt to try and get it moving. So, at first, the investigators thought that the car must have run out of gas or suffered some other kind of mechanical failure, but neither was true. Adding to the mystery, all the car's doors were left unlocked and the driver's side window was rolled down. And then, just like that, the car was abandoned. The window rolled down is interesting to me because the only time I feel like you would do that in the middle of a snow-capped mountain would be to talk to someone, no? But this is where this whole scene becomes even more unsettling, because you remember we talked earlier about the fact that this car meant everything to Jack Madruga. This wasn't just transportation to him, it was his prized possession. He worked on it himself, he kept it in pristine condition, and he never let anyone besides himself behind the wheel. So what could have possibly made him drive it into the middle of a freezing, isolated mountain wilderness and then just walk away? For those who knew Jack and the rest of the group, this scene made no sense. It wasn't just unusual, it was completely out of character with no explanation. Why? Had they left the car willingly? And if so, why? Did they get lost? Did something or someone force them into the frozen wilderness on foot? None of it was adding up. A massive search of Plumas National Forest was launched, but before it could even gain momentum, a brutal storm rolled in, forcing the rescuers to delay the efforts for several days. And when they were finally able to resume the search, nothing was found, and not a single new clue surfaced for 4 months. Deep into the remote wilderness of Plumas National Forest, scattered throughout the area, were ranger stations and service trailers. Small little shelters that were stocked with emergency supplies. Inside, these trailers contained everything you would need to survive: beds, canned food rations, blankets, flashlights, and other essential gear. By early June, as the heavy snow in the mountains finally began to melt, a group of men riding motorcycles made their way up to inspect the trailers. That winter had been brutal, and they needed to check if there was any storm damage. And when this group of men arrived at one particular service trailer, something immediately stood out. A window had been shattered, and outside, scattered on the ground right below the smashed window, were empty food ration cans. Someone had clearly been here, and unless wildlife had learned how to use a can opener, it wasn't an animal. And then as the men entered the trailer, the smell hit them. A heavy, stomach-churning odor, the unmistakable stench of death. Inside one of the trailer bedrooms, laying on the bed, was a body tightly wrapped in 8 layers of bed sheets and blankets. The corpse was severely decomposed and nearly mummified, and it didn't take long for them to confirm what they already suspected. The remains belonged to Ted Weiher. A later examination by the coroner made it official, but even before that, there was little doubt. Ted was wearing the same clothes he had the night that he disappeared, except for his socks and shoes. And beside the bed that he was laying on the nightstand was his wallet. And the nightmare of the Yuba County Five was far from over. Severe frostbite and gangrene had set in, and 5 of his toes were completely gone. And by the time that Ted died, he lost nearly half of his body weight. His official cause of death was listed as hypothermia and starvation. But here's where things get even more disturbing and bizarre and strange and unexplainable. Ted had access to food. He had access to warmth, yet he froze and starved to death. Just outside the trailer where his body was found were 2 sheds. One was stocked with enough canned food rations to feed someone for over a year. The other contained heating supplies, blankets, torches, gasoline, oil heaters, even a butane tank that, if turned on, could have provided both light and heat to the entire trailer. And both of these sheds had been pried open with a tool, likely a pry bar, but strangely, the trailer full of heating supplies looked completely untouched. And while some of the food had been eaten from the rations, it was nowhere in what you would expect for 5 men alone in the wilderness, especially since Ted Weiher died of starvation. But even more baffling, Ted had survived for months in the wilderness with food sitting right outside. So why did he starve to death next to a fully stocked supply shed? And more importantly, where were the other 4 men? The only sign that any of the other 4 men had even been in the trailer was a single clue: a pair of Gary Mathias' sneakers. They were left near the bedroom where Ted's body was found. Ted's own boots, however, were missing. The most likely explanation was that Gary had swapped out his sneakers for Ted's boots before heading back out into the freezing wilderness. But there was still this one huge, enormous question: where did he go? And where did they all go? And probably the strangest aspect of it all was that this trailer was 20 miles away from where their car was parked. Why did they walk 20 miles through freezing, treacherous terrain in nothing but t-shirts and jeans? Because, like I said, the car was found parked at the snow line. So behind them was perfect terrain. There was no snow behind them. Why did they trek 20 miles into knee-high snow? The search efforts were restarted, this time focusing on the 20-mile stretch between the abandoned car and the trailer. About 11 miles from the car, searchers made a grim discovery. It was the remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling. By this point, their bodies were pretty much reduced to bones after being picked apart by animals and after months of decomposition. The widely accepted theory on how Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling died was that on the long and brutal trek to the trailer 20 miles away, either Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, or both of them collapsed from hypothermia. The most likely answer is that one of them collapsed from hypothermia and that the other chose to stick by their best friend's side, and that the 2 of them heartbreakingly died together. That one of them refused to leave their best friend behind. And then less than 2 miles from where the trailer was, where Ted Weiher's body was found, another discovery. Jack Huett's own father, who had volunteered to help with the search, stumbled upon his son's remains. Reports say that he spotted his son Jack's jacket in some bushes, and when he went to pick it up, his son's spine fell to the ground. Imagine the horror and the sheer trauma of that moment. It's unimaginable. More of Jack's bones were found scattered nearby, and given how close his body was to the trailer, There's been debate over whether he died on the way there or if he made it to the trailer and then later left, possibly trying to get help or make it back to the car. What makes the most sense to me is that tragically, Jack Huett passed away only 1.7 miles away from shelter. It honestly doesn't make sense that he was able to hike 20 miles to the trailer just fine or fine enough, only to pass away less than 2 miles on the hike back. Also, there was no sign that Jack Huett was ever in the trailer. And perhaps the biggest mystery of all, to this day, Gary Mathias or his remains have never been found. Before we start theorizing, there are some witness accounts that we absolutely have to go over because they might just change everything. On the night that the boys vanished, they weren't the only ones struggling on that desolate, icy mountain road. That same night, another man named Joseph Schoen had also driven up that mountain. He was there to check on a cabin that him and his family planned to stay at over the weekend, when his Volkswagen Beetle got stuck in the snow and ice. Frustrated but determined, Joe got out to try and push his car free, but then something much worse happened. Joe started to have a heart attack. Imagine that, alone in the freezing dark, stuck in the middle of nowhere, and now was the time for his heart to start failing. Joe had a history of heart problems, so he knew that panicking would only make it worse, so he forced himself to stay calm. He climbed back into his car, trying to keep warm and ride it out. And then something strange happened. Somewhere around 11:30 midnight, Joe noticed 2 sets of headlights approaching, and then he heard whistling. He said it sounded like someone trying to call a dog. Pulling up behind him was the 1969 Mercury Montego, and also an old rusty red pickup truck. And through his rear view mirror, Joe said that he saw about 6 or 7 people standing outside the 2 vehicles together. One of them, he said, looked to be a woman holding a baby. And right here, Joe thought that he was saved. He climbed out of his car and he started calling for help, but as soon as he did, everyone went silent. Kind of like you walk into a room and everyone immediately quiets down and you think that they were just talking about you. It was kind of like that. And then suddenly everyone scattered, or they all piled into that red pickup truck because just moments later the truck backed up and drove away. Now that's weird, but it gets even stranger. Just about an hour later, Joe still sitting in his car trying to stay calm, he saw some flashlights in the distance near the tree line. He said it looked like multiple lights, multiple people with flashlights going back and forth, like they were wandering, maybe looking for something. So again, he gets out and tries to call for help, but as soon as he did, the flashlights, they went dark. And at this point, Joe knew that he had to do something. His car was out of gas. If he stayed inside the car, he likely would have froze to death. So he made the brutal decision to get out and walk down the mountain. Somehow he managed to make it all the way down the mountain and he reached a lodge at the base. From there, he hitched a ride home. Later, he told his story to the police multiple times after hearing about the boys' disappearance. He also went to the hospital to treat his heart attack, which was confirmed that he did have a heart attack at some point. And this story that Joe was saying, it wasn't just a wild claim. Joe's account is actually widely accepted as fact. Even the park ranger that found Jack Madruga's Montego confirmed that Joe's car was also there, found abandoned exactly where he said it was, near Jack Madruga's vehicle. Joe's presence that night is undeniable, but does his story line up? There are some holes I personally think that we can poke in his story, but let's put that aside for now. What really interests me is his claim that the boys were with other people. A couple maybe? A man, a woman, a baby, and a red pickup truck. Who were these people? Where did the boys meet them? And more disturbingly, why did all 5 men end up hiking 20 miles into the freezing unknown after meeting up with them? And as investigators began to scramble for answers, they issued a public plea and a cash reward for any information that could help crack the case. Tips and false sightings came flooding in, but 2 particular accounts stood out. and ones that, while bizarre, might actually be credible. Before we dive into these two witness accounts, I'm just gonna let you know that they will make you even more confused, and they seem far-fetched, but just bear with me a little bit, okay? Because it will all connect in the end. One particularly strange lead came from a man who lived in Yuba City, the same hometown as the five men, but he just so happened to own property in the Plumas National Forest near where the boys disappeared. And his claim was that a year before the men disappeared, he was up at his property in Plumas National Forest, and he saw Ted Weiher on the exact same mountain that a year later he would vanish from. And that Ted wasn't alone. He was with an older man and a younger boy, possibly the older man's son. The witness said that he knew that this was Ted Weiher without a doubt because he actually lived right around the corner from Ted and Ted's family. He even stopped to ask Ted what he was doing so deep in the woods, and Ted said that him and the two strangers that he was with were there hunting. And then the three of them got into their vehicle and they drove off. And Ted's family, when they heard this witness sighting, were stunned because it made absolutely no sense. Like we've said twice already, Ted was terrified of the outdoors. He was scared of the woods. He was also scared of guns. He was scared of the dark, and he hated hunting. He quite literally wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone shoot an animal. And his family had no idea who these two men that he was out in the woods hunting with could be. So why was Ted, out of all people, out in the middle of nowhere of two strangers hunting in a place where he would later die? Another bizarre set of sightings came from a gas station and convenience store in Brownsville. Now this is really interesting because this town just so happened to be along the route the five men would have taken if they had, for some reason, intentionally taken an exit to drive towards Plumas National Forest instead of going home. A woman recalled pulling into the parking lot of this gas station and convenience store, and she said next to her in the parking lot were two men sitting in a vehicle. She said that she believed these two men to be mentally handicapped. She said they gave her the biggest grin and waved at her. She waved back. She said that she also saw two more men standing in a phone booth that was right in front of the store as she was walking in. After a few minutes, all four men got back in the vehicle together and drove off. When shown a photo lineup, she was able to identify all four men except for Gary Mathias. And she wasn't the only one at this store to see the four men. The store owner himself confirmed this sighting, and he said that this group of men actually came into the store 2 days in a row buying snacks, candy, soda. But here's the thing, these two supposed sightings were on February 25th and February 26th. Those are the 2 days after the men vanished. So this completely shatters everything that we think we know about this case. Why would they be in this random town hanging around buying snacks 2 days after they disappeared? Why would they intentionally not be at this tournament, this basketball game that they were so excited about doing? This sighting would be easy to dismiss as just another false sighting, except for one chilling detail. Both the witness who saw Ted in the mountain a year earlier and these witnesses at the store in Brownsville mentioned the exact same thing. An old, faded, rusty red pickup truck. The same kind of truck that Joseph Sean claimed to have seen on the mountain the night that the men disappeared. The one that pulled up behind him with Jack Madruga's car. The man who saw Ted in the woods a year prior said that when Ted and the two strangers left, they got into that old faded red pickup truck. And the witness at the store said that the four men, all minus Gary Mathias, were in that old, rusty, faded red pickup truck. It's all connected, but what does it mean? So now let's dive into all the possible theories, or at least just a handful, because there's no shortage on theories in this case. I'm going to do my best to present each of them to the best of my abilities. Just note that these are all theories and just speculation. I did not come up with any of these theories myself, and I'm not presenting any of them as fact. Now that that's out of the way, let's dive into our first theory. The first theory, and probably the one that was most believed at the time that this case was actually taking place, back in the 1970s, back before mental illness, autism, and intellectual disabilities weren't as understood as they are today. As I explain this theory to you, just understand that I do not believe this theory in any way. These are not my words. I'm just presenting it to you as it was believed in the time of the 1970s. And that is that these 5 men were just too severely handicapped, that they were too stupid, that they just got lost in the woods, ended up in the mountain, in the snow, and either froze to death, or because they were just so stupid, starved to death next to food. I want to move past this theory as quickly as possible, give it as little attention as possible. I'm only presenting it to you because I knew if I didn't talk about it, the comments would, and I just want to take the time to set the record straight. These 5 men being mentally handicapped is the most focused on and misunderstood aspect of this case. These were high-functioning, competent, intelligent men. Despite living at home, they were all pretty independent. It was the 1970s, and their own parents were okay with the 5 of them all driving together an hour away to go to a basketball game together, unsupervised. In my opinion, these men would not have gone into the freezing mountains on accident. I don't think they would have done it unless they felt like they had no other choice. So now that that's out of the way, let's get into some more theories. And this next theory is probably the most widely believed theory today, at least. It's the theory that is brought up the most on Reddit, in YouTube comments, in documentaries, and that is that Gary Mathias either accidentally or intentionally killed his best friends. This theory is believed for multiple reasons, the first obviously being that Gary Mathias was never found, and also because Gary was considered the leader of the group. It's been thrown around that if he suggested a late night walk through the mountains, that his friends might have followed his lead. And then there's the even more sinister theory that Gary could have murdered his 4 best friends in the mountains. Gary did have that criminal history and a history of violence. In his early 20s, only a few years before meeting his friends, Gary used to get into a lot of bar fights with men because he used to grope their girlfriends or their wives. There's this other story where Gary, after getting into an altercation with a man, began yelling in the face of that man's 3-year-old daughter and then threatened to kill this man's 3-year-old daughter. And then there was this other time where a couple woke up in the middle of the night with Gary standing over them after breaking into their home, and then he just started talking gibberish about Satan and the devil. It's scary stuff. Clearly, Gary was mentally unstable. He had these psychotic episodes and he could be violent at times. But this was all before Gary got involved with the Gateway Projects and before he met his best friends and before he was being treated for his schizophrenia. I don't think that Gary would have killed his best friends. Everyone said that after meeting those 4 boys, Gary's life changed for the better. He was super protective over them and would not have hurt them. And I think it's very sad that almost 50 years later, a lot of people still accuse him of doing something to his best friends. What I think happened to Gary Mathias is that for whatever reason, him and the other 4 were walking in the freezing, snowy wilderness. Why they were doing that, I don't know. But on that 20-mile hike to that service trailer, Jack, and Bill tragically succumbed to the elements. I think that Gary and Ted were the only 2 to ever make it to that trailer. And by that time, Ted was just in a terrible condition. By then, Ted had already lost 4 of his toes from how cold it was. I think 4 months that Gary tried to keep his friend Ted alive, all while not being able to take his schizophrenia medication that he was supposed to take twice a day, but that he didn't take with them because he thought that he was, again, just going to a basketball game with his best friends. God knows what he was experiencing at that time. It must have been really, really scary for him. What really baffles me about this time is that there were no signs that Gary or Ted, mostly Gary, tried to start a fire. Even if they didn't know how to start that butane tank, there were a lot of things that they could have set a fire with, but they never did. Many have speculated that the reason that they never started a fire was because they were scared of someone and afraid that the smoke from the fire would lead them to them. Once Ted passed away, out of respect, it's believed that Gary was the one that wrapped up Ted's body in those 8 layers of sheets, and then he left the trailer, maybe to find his way back to the car or to find help, and likely also died in the mountains, and that his remains just have yet to be found. Personally, I do believe that whatever happened to these 5 men, at least, started the ball moving on whatever happened to them, had something to do with foul play. So let's dive into a few more possibilities. There's also a really huge theory that Joseph Schoen, the man who also got stuck in the mountains the same night as our boys, possibly had something to do with the disappearance and death of the Yuba County Five, or at least knows more than he told the police. This is thrown around because Joe changed his story a lot. Now, Joe has been described as not really being the greatest guy. He was a huge alcoholic drunk, like the town drunk. He was a liar. He was kind of just like a huge jerk in town. He was always picking fights, driving drunk, driving his car off the road and crashing it. He was really hated by most of his hometown, that there was even a little town joke that if Joe was ever murdered, the case would never be able to be solved because there would be too many suspects. So that really tells you a lot about the kind of guy that Joe was. So the reason that Joe even said that he was on the mountain the day that his car got stuck and the Yuba County Five disappeared was that he was checking on his cabin that him and his family planned to stay at that weekend. Well, that was just a lie. Joe did not own a cabin, and there were no records of him renting one. It's super sketchy. And when Joe walked down the mountain, multiple witnesses overheard him in a really distressed way with like his head in his hands. I should have done this 2 years ago. What does that mean? And Joe's story about what he saw on the top of that mountain changed more times than I could count, with nearly every detail changing at some point. One time while talking to the police, he said he saw that red truck. The next time he says that he didn't see that red truck, and then again, he saw the red truck. At one point, he said that there were 6 or 7 people that he saw. Another time, he said it was anywhere between 2 and 12. And when Joe was admitted into the hospital to treat his heart problems, the hospital staff said that Joe cried for days hysterically and no one could calm him down. The only time that Joe could pull himself together was when the police came to question him. It was actually the 3rd time that the police had talked to Joe, was at this time when he was in the hospital. And out of nowhere, during this questioning, Joe, unwarranted, just blurted out, "You think I know more than I'm letting on." Is that a guilty conscience speaking? It's all very circumstantial, and there's nothing that concretely proves that Joe had anything to do with the disappearance and death of the Yuba County Five. I think a lot of Joe's odd behavior, his lying, his inconsistencies could easily be explained by the fact that that night, Joe was incredibly drunk. Many witnesses saw Joe at a few different bars the night that he got his car stuck and the Yuba County Five disappeared. It's very likely that while he was incredibly intoxicated, he accidentally got lost on that road and maybe just lied to the police to avoid another DUI. There's also another theory thrown around mostly online that since it was the 1970s and Gary, at the very least we know, used to dabble around with recreational marijuana use, that maybe on their way home after watching that basketball game together and all the men are excited talking about their own game the following day, that maybe one of them, probably Gary, suggested that they celebrate a little bit early by picking up some pot on the way home and getting a little high. Allegedly, Gary had some old friends from his previous life who dealt drugs in the town that was near the Plumas National Forest. Could the men have detoured out of their way just to pick up some weed? Then maybe like a fight broke out that caused the men to flee and they were possibly chased up that mountain and then they ran into the woods for safety? Let me know what you think about that one. I've seen a lot of people talk about it on Reddit and it makes sense, but not completely, at least in my opinion. but let me know what you think. I know I said that none of the theories I was going to present to you were my own, but while I was going over this case and like talking about it out loud, there was something I thought about that I figured I would share. What if these kind, sweet, trusting, and sometimes naive men were tricked by someone with ill intentions? So Joe's story, Joe, who was also stuck on the mountain, he said that he saw the 5 men on the mountain, possibly with a couple, another man and a woman holding a baby. This reminded me a lot of the kidnapping of Colleen Stan, who was kidnapped by a couple with a baby because she trusted them because they were just a young couple with a baby. What if the men on their drive home late at night, they saw a car parked off the side of the road, possibly maybe a red rusty old pickup truck, right? And outside the car, there is a man and a woman holding a little baby, and they're flagging down someone to help, saying that they just had, some car problems. I feel like our boys, the Yuba County Five, would be the exact kinds of men that would have stopped to help this young couple and a baby with their car problems, especially Jack Madruga, who worked on his own car. Could this have been a setup possibly for something more sinister? Could have whatever happened next have just transpired from there? I don't know, I'm just spitballing, but I do think that there's possibly something there, especially if you believe Joe's story of seeing a woman on the mountain with the boys with the baby. Honestly, I feel like I could talk about this case for hours and make like 5 episodes on this case at least. This one truly has me stumped, and it's had people stumped for almost 50 years. The only thing that I believe is undeniable is that something scared those 5 men so much that they ran into the freezing mountains, choosing to freeze to death rather than face whatever threat had horrified them so much. What are all your thoughts? What are all your theories? I'm really looking forward to reading your guys' theories and what you think, what theory you believe is the most likely. And as always, thank you so much for watching or listening to this episode of Hot on the Case. Please be sure to subscribe, follow, like, rate, and review the show. And I will see you guys all next week when we are hot on the case once again.